Okay, so talking about fracture, there are two types of failure. There's a ductile and a brittle type failure. Okay, and so fracture, if you recall, it's the separation of a body into pieces due to the stress, and these are, of course, tested at temperatures that are below the melt point. So we wouldn't want to ultimately separate the material into pieces due to melting. So we do this, of course, well below its melt point typically. Okay, so for very ductile materials like metals, we might expect a lot of plastic deformation and ultimately significant necking until ultimately the sample kind of fails into two pieces, and this is characterized as ductile failure. Okay, so here the percent elongation, so that is the percent elongation at break, delta L over L times 100%, would be very large for this ductile material. So that ductile failure is characterized by very large percent elongation. Percent reduction in area, if you recall, is calculated as the A minus A at failure, so the original cross-sectional area minus the area at failure, divided by that original cross-sectional area times 100%. So similarly, the percent reduction in area would be very large. So that is to say that the area at failure is going to be much, much smaller than the original area, perhaps represented here by the material that didn't neck at all up here. Okay, reduction area is going to be large for a ductile failure. Contrasting that to a brittle type failure, the percent elongation, so the delta L over L times 100%, is going to be very small. So there's going to be almost no length change as a percentage at the failure condition. So the strain at break will be a very small value. Similarly, the percent reduction in cross-sectional area, the percent RA, is going to be very small. There's going to be almost no change to the area at failure relative to the area that we started with, which might be represented by an area far away from the failure zone. Okay, so those are the two main failure modes, ductile and brittle. Brittle, of course, characteristic of ceramic materials, and ductile, more characteristic of metals and certain polymers. Certain materials will land in between, and so you can have moderate ductility if these values are, if the percent reduction in area or percent elongation at failure is in between that of a classic ceramic and a classic kind of metal. Okay, so what have we said there? Ductile fracture. This is typical of most metals, and in fact, this is what's preferred because we'll see here that the material tends to be cracks that develop in the material tend to be stable. So that is, the material can survive its function, survive its intended use in service before an ultimate catastrophic failure. Okay, so this is one reason why it might be preferred. Also, on its way to failure, we would observe necking. So typically, inspections can catch failure before it's catastrophic. Okay, so we'll see here that as part of the failure mode, we're going to see that there's internal cracks and that these features inside will be stable provided that the applied stress isn't increasing past that generated these cracks. So long as the stress that generated these cracks is no longer increasing, this crack can remain stable. So another reason why ductile fracture is preferred for materials applications. Brittle fracture, on the other hand, we typically see that in ceramics. Very cold materials can fail this way. And here there's very little plastic deformation, as we saw, so very little opportunity to change the shape of the cross-sectional area at the failure spot. So the cross-sectional area reflected with the percent RA value won't change much, as well as the percent elongation at break. We would need significant plastic deformation if we're going to have high percent EL and percent RA values. Unfortunately, with ceramics, cracks are very unstable, and they propagate rapidly without even increasing the applied stress. So kind of parking a ceramic at this point where a crack is developing internally, that crack will not stabilize. It'll ultimately advance the material to full fracture, full failure. So again, brittle fracture is less desirable because there's little opportunity to kind of replace a part about to fail and to ultimately avoid catastrophic failure modes. Okay, so let's talk more about that sort of crack that was stable and key to ductile failure. So the failure stages begin where we start to see necking. Okay, so this is where the cross-sectional area is now starting to decrease relative to the initial cross-sectional area. This necking advances until ultimately there's void nucleation. So here, shown in the middle of the gauge portion where necking is occurring, we see voids nucleated. So 3 little void spaces have nucleated as the applied stress increases. Ultimately, these voids will coalesce and come together to give us an internal feature, a coalesced void. Okay, and then at this point, there's very little material left in the cross-sectional area, and significant shearing will occur at the surface here. So, in other words, shear will occur and break the remaining outer boundaries of this internal void or crack. And ultimately, we have fracture. So, fracture analysis typically involves microscopy or high magnification optical inspection of the surfaces after fracture. Okay, so let's take a look at that. You'll see here that we expect that there'll be significant kind of texture to the middle portion where the void and cracks coalesced. So this texture will be reminiscent of the voids that had once been created under the stress leading to the void nucleation. And so we'll see a lot of kind of texture there. And ultimately, something has led to the nucleation. So typically, it's a foreign material like a particle or other deliberately added materials there. So particles or impurities tend to serve as void nucleation sites to begin the void nucleation and ultimately lead to coalescence and permit final shearing. You'll see here in the larger view cross-section of the topmost portion that we see that zone here where we observe the shearing surface. So here it's a much more smooth surface where the metal has sheared away from itself to create the final option. So this sort of cup and cone fragments are often complementary, and you often see that in ductile fracture modes. Okay, so clearly the internal crack where lots of voids had coalesced occupied an area about that much, and then ultimately shear occurred to create the sort of final cup in the cross-section of the material. Okay, so these data, for example, here were for a steel material that went through ductile failure. Okay, so in that, to contrast that, for the ceramics, a brittle fracture mode, really there's no plastic deformation and there would be very little void nucleation or crack, and so there's going to be a lot of shearing to ultimately fracture the materials, as we might predict and have seen in our little cartoons here. So there's going to be very little deformation here. So at the end of the day, we'd have to propagate a crack uniformly by a general mechanism from edge to edge in the gauge of this portion of the sample. And so really what we have are two options. We have a transgranular crack propagation where we go across grains. So you see our crack indicated by the red line moves across grains of crystals of the ceramic material. Or there can be intragranular crack, where the crack propagates between grains and never crosses a grain. And so the exact kind of fracture mode here depends on the ceramic material in question. And so often you would have to consider textbooks for that information, and or other advanced microscopy could help you see if you are observing more grains as a function of cracking through a material versus along the boundaries of grains.